Ich heiße Alena Rettóva, ich arbeite in London an der SOAS, der School of Oriental and African Studies, und ich interessiere mich dafür, wie Spengler in der afrikanischen Philosophie aufgenommen und reflektiert wird. So thank you so much for this invitation. I really enjoyed the 3 days that we've spent together. I think I've learned a lot. Maybe I should start with my perception of Spengler. So I came across his name when I studied philosophy very early on. So that would be in the mid-1990s. And of course I was unable to access his work. I was fascinated by the title, basically. And I was trying to get hold of him, but at that time there was no internet, or at least no practical, no workable internet. There was no Amazon, at least for me. And he was not in the library. So I stayed with this kind of hunger for many years. But I have worked with another text. So in a way I will be, basically I'm departing more from the reading of Spengler by Jan Patočka, a Czech philosopher, than from Spengler himself, whom I only got to read actually quite recently. So I don't consider myself very much Spenglerian, and I do apologize if I do not contribute much to the body of knowledge on Spengler, because I'll be really moving out a little bit. Yeah, it's there. So basically Jan Patočka, a Czech philosopher who died in 1977 after he was brutally interrogated by the secret police. He did not publish many works because obviously he was a persona non grata in the academia and in the intellectual circles of the then Czechoslovakia. But many of his works got edited and published after 1989. And this is also the case of a work that he wrote in German. In German it's called Europa und nach Europa. In Czech it was published as Evropa a doba poevropská, which means Europe and the time after Europe, where he actually takes issues with Spengler. He quotes Spengler, although he never mentions the name. This is the reference to Spengler in that book. He says, the decline of the West, and as you can see he puts it in quotation marks, so it's really referring to the work, which to my knowledge has not been translated into Czech, so he basically read it in German. Which we talk about here is no longer a dark prophecy, that's referring to Spengler, based on speculations about the periodization of the development of cultures, but an empirical reality that our work is trying to explain by means of ideo-historical analysis. So he's taking the decline of the West as a fact, as something, as a given, something that has already happened. And then he's trying to elaborate what that means for the European civilization, for Europe, but also for what he calls the heirs of Europe. Now, what is this concept nach Europa, the post-European time, according to Patočka? He already suggests something about it here, and there is a perhaps clearer definition of that in an article by Karel Novotný, who says, zunächst ist es deutlich, dass dieser Begriff, das heißt noch nach Europa, mit dem Ende Europas zusammenhängt. Das Ende Europas wird als ein historisches Faktum aufgenommen. Spätestens im Zweiten Weltkrieg hat Europa seine Stellung der Weltmacht verloren. Von diesem Untergang Europas geht Patočka aus und versucht, die neue, nun kommende Situation, die damit entstanden ist und entsteht, zu beschreiben. Es ist aus der Art und Weise, wie Patočka über Europa und nach Europa spricht, klar, dass er nicht den geografischen Begriff Europa im Sinne hat, sondern dass er an ein historisches Phänomen Europa bzw. nach Europa denkt, von dem allein gesagt werden kann, dass es entstanden bzw. im Entstehen ist und ergehen kann. So I think this clarifies further what Patočka was referring to when he was speaking of nach Europa. That's very important. It's a given. It's something that has already happened. What is then the pre-nach Europa? What is Europe for Patočka? He identifies inside referring to Husserl, as a principle of Europe. So he speaks of the European principle and clarifies it as the principle of rational reflection, that is, a reflection that founds all action and thought on insight. And he distinguishes that from two things. One is Europe as a historical power, which he mentions in this subsequent quotation, and one is what he calls European heritage. So he says, the Europe as a historical power formation that has been superior to the rest of the world and has unsuccessfully tried to dominate the entire earth is connected to the generalization of the European heritage, which he then explains as science, technology, rational organization of economy and society. Now, my question in this paper is, how do the heirs challenge this European principle? And who are the heirs, really? Yes, well, I'm in the right place then. But maybe, I will diverge a little bit as I move on. So who are the heirs? And this is also really interesting. So Patočka is writing in the 1970s from a very, if you like, closed society of the socialist Czechoslovakia. Of course, he means primarily as the heirs, US and China. Those are the new powers of the world who have adopted one part of the heritage, instrumental rationality, but have not adopted the moral implications of insight. So these are the main heirs that he's actually referring to and analyzing. But he also mentions other groups, and I found these formulations really intriguing. In fact, they are not very nice, not very politically correctly formulated. He speaks of random negative products of European rationalism or byproducts of European or Europoid world. So I would like to look at these non-heirs, these sort of eclipsed heirs of the European principle, if you like. And I would like to read African philosophy through this prism, through this perspective. So I would suggest that Africans are actually living the end of Europe and theorizing it in African philosophy. And what they identify the end of Europe with colonialism. Now, guilt aside, what colonialism means on this reading is, and I quote from Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism, colonialism actually dehumanizes both the perpetrator and the victim. That's the main point. Colonialism turns rationality into a principle of conquest. So again, that kind of moral principle of insight, or the part that is moral, is removed from this European heritage there. Césaire says, colonization, I repeat, dehumanizes even the most civilized man. That colonial activity, colonial enterprise, colonial conquest, which is based on contempt for the native and justified by that contempt, inevitably tends to change him who undertakes it. That the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. So this is the reading of colonialism as an end of Europe, as a kind of denial of the European principle, where really rationality is turned into this kind of rapacious conquest of the world. And indeed, post-colonial theory also tends to see colonialism and the post-colonial period as this period of decline. And I'm quoting from this article with a very drastic name, a pre-mortem prognosis. The collapse of the continent that owned almost one half of the globe generated a profoundly unsettling soul-searching and re-examination of the values and norms of metropolitan civilization, informed by the Enlightenment masculinist, and quasi-racist rationality. Now, if we take that as the point of departure, then, I just want to get the transitions a little bit. what is happening in African philosophy. So African philosophy theorizes this end of Europe, and it effectually, especially in the early stages, by which I'm referring to roughly the mid-20th century and maybe until the 80s or 90s. So that's, early stages of a particular discourse on African philosophy. It is a philosophical affirmation of a difference from Europe. So I think this is really interesting. How is that difference conceptualized, especially given the condition of being colonized, where there is undeniable continuity with that European civilization? So how is that difference conceptualized? How is it challenged? And how can we challenge those challenges, perhaps? I would like to suggest that there are several different takes on it, and I would like to go through some of the main ones. I'm not being exhaustive, and I would also like to say right in the beginning that I think the really interesting part of it is when we actually get beyond this dynamics, this binary West and Africa, and we can actually go into discourses in African languages, for instance. But for the time being, if we look into this dynamics between Europe and what comes after from the perspective of African philosophers, we can look at differences as they were specified in epistemology and ontology. So I would like to start with these two branches. So epistemology. Epistemology has been an extremely important part of African philosophy for obvious reasons. It is the way we know the world that determines the way we are in the world. So epistemology, or constructing an epistemology that would be seen as distinctly African or Afrocentric, was at the very heart of the African philosophy project. Now, in this reading, as you can see, or as I'm suggesting, Europe is identified with its epistemology. And this is very much in line with what Husserl said and what Patočka said. This is a quotation from a Tanzanian writer and philosopher, Euphrates Keselahabi, who, I think the quotation tells you several important things. First of all, he's speaking of the tragic epistemology of the Western man. So he really points out that epistemology is that which needs to be questioned and perhaps redefined or avoided. And then secondly, you can see what this epistemology of Western man is in a way reduced to. So there is a certain model or simplification of what is covered by this concept of Western epistemology or Western epistemological order by many African philosophers, which is the split of reality into subject and object. Again, starting from Descartes and the Enlightenment. Why would this become problematic? And can we think epistemology otherwise? So it is problematic because it's seen as a fragmentation of reality, of lived reality. Now, of course, it seems so obvious. Can we actually think epistemology otherwise, or what are other possibilities? They have been proposed by African philosophers, and I will mention three prominent figures, two of whom are critical to what they identify as the Western model of knowledge. The first one is Léopold Sédar Senghor. He was a poet, first and foremost. He never identified himself as a philosopher, but effectively he wrote philosophical works. He was also a politician. He became the first president of the independent Senegal, and which is very important, he resigned by himself. So he maintained some form of democracy and inside his country. He was the main theorist of a movement that was called Negritude, which started in Paris. You can see Senghor basically visited Paris, and it was a meeting place for intellectuals from the New World and from Africa. And it was there that these African philosophers actually got the idea of Africa, because they were not coming as Africans, they were coming as who they were, and suddenly they saw themselves from this external position of Europe as Africans. It created a kind of identity or unity which perhaps did not exist before they entered this external position. What is negritude, and why is it called negritude? Of course, negritude means blackness, It's a theorization of the black experience in the world. And these theorists they in a way inverted values of colonialism. So they put everything upside down. They worked with colonial stereotypes very consciously, as we shall see. And they also worked with the terminology of colonialism. So Senghor always used the word Negro, which obviously, if I teach it at SOAS, I cannot use the word anymore. It's something that has really come out of use, and even as a quotation, it tends to be triggering to students. So, but he used it. He used it for a good reason. He was really ironic. He was mocking the colonial perception of black people. He said that the black knowledge or black epistemology, and again he spoke about African or black, where blackness sometimes involved broader groups of people than just Africans. He said that black reason is intuitive, emotive. It produces knowledge by participation, by merging with the other, dancing the other. Now look at the word dancing. So again, it's the colonial stereotype. You have the dancing African, and now he's saying, but dancing actually can mean something completely different. It's not just bodily movement with music, but it is a way of being in the world. How do we interpret dancing? Now, dancing the other as a mode of knowledge or as epistemology was only possible because this epistemology was supported by an ontology of rhythm. And again, rhythm, colonial stereotype. Right? You have the drums, and you have people dancing to the drums. He said, but rhythm is something much more complex. Rhythm, as he said, is the architecture of being, and he developed it further. Rhythm is the architecture of being, the internal dynamic which gives form, the system of waves which it sets out towards others, the pure expression of the vital force. Now, vital force is a quotation of another scholar that we will see later. Rhythm is the impetus of vibration, the force which nails us through our senses to the origin of being. And he goes on like that. He gives examples how rhythm is expressed. The most sensuous means, lines, surfaces, colors, volumes in architecture. So in a way, everything is rhythmic. Reality is arranged to the principle of repetition. That is rhythmic. And then that sends out, as he says, waves towards the subject. And then being receptive to that is dancing. So it's, in a way, it requires that the subject, or the person, rather, I should not use the word subject here, the person somehow identifies with those rhythmic waves and knows things. Again, this is just a definition or repetition of what he said, where he defines rhythm. And then, so the rhythm, and then this is dancing the other. And you can see how he explicitly pits it against European epistemology, or again, European thinkers. He says, I think, therefore I am, wrote Descartes, who was the European par excellence. The African Negro could say, I feel, I dance the other, I am. He has no need to think, but to live the other by dancing it. Now, to dance is to discover and to recreate, to identify oneself with the forces of life, to lead a fuller life, and in short, to be. It is at any rate the highest form of knowledge. And thus, the knowledge of the African Negro is at the same time discovery and creation, recreation. Now, what does he say here? He's opposing the two epistemologies against one another, and he actually elaborates that further in his theory. He has a theory of complementary equality of races, which means that races are different but equal. That's how he expressed it, and you can imagine how much he has been criticized for it. Emotion is black as much as reason is Greek. So he says epistemology distinguishes peoples. Now, I wanted to add to the dancing. I think he's actually, or my reading of this is that he's expressing a different way of knowing. There is a Senegalese philosopher called Souleymane Bachir Diagne who said, I wish we could read Senghor without blackness. because it is so extremely interesting if you take away the race element of it. And you can see he's theorizing a way of knowing that he opposes to the kind of cold, distant scientific knowledge. He gives the example, for example, dancing the antelope. If you want to know what an antelope is, you can kill the animal, dissect it, and you know the structure, but you don't really get the antelopeness because the animal is dead. So, very good. So he's basically advocating for another way of knowing, which he calls dancing then. You can dance the antelope, not about the antelope, but you can somehow identify with the animal. And of course there are also ways of knowing that are similar to that, for example in art, that have been theorized under aesthetics or behavioral learning. All of these things are actually, if you like, non-subject-object ways of knowing. So this is just on the side of how he places it. I think I can go to this. The reason of classical Europe is analytic through utilization. The reason of the African Negro, intuitive through participation. So he really aligns these modes of knowing with specific cultures. He was severely and harshly criticized by almost everybody. And it's only now, I think, that, like the philosopher I mentioned, Bashir Diagne, that people are actually trying to read him for what he says and not for what he said about blackness. Marcien Toa, a Cameroonian philosopher, read Senghor very critically. You can see this second work, Léopold Sédar Senghor, Négritude ou Servitude, Negritude or Servitude. So he basically said the obvious, that no matter how he expresses the colonial stereotypes, he further entrenches them. So he's actually working against African liberation, and he advocated, so again he identifies Europe with epistemology, similarly to Senghor, but he advocated for a giving up of that difference. In fact, he says, dwelling on the difference, sorry, I have to skip a little bit. Dwelling on difference is harmful to Africa. So he says, if our goal is liberation, the least advisable thing that we can do is certainly the restoration of the old world, the conservation of our specificity, the cult of difference and of originality. The cause of our defeat and our actual condition of effective dependence must be sought in our specificity, in that which makes us different from Europe. Sorry, did I forget? Oh, yes, sorry. I was just, I forgot something. In that which makes us different from Europe and nowhere else. For if our old world could not resist the clash with the European world, it was surely because of something which differentiated it in from Europe. So he advocates for Africans to acquire the power of the West, as he puts it. He says, our freedom, the affirmation of our humanity, passes through the identification and the mastery of the principle of European power. And what is that principle? European philosophy. So he calls it the weapon of the West. It is at the origin of European power, and he advocates for a kind of negation of self and acceptance of this other philosophy of Western philosophy. So you can see very extreme positions in these two thinkers. Now I want to come to another thinker, Euphrates Keslahabi. That's the one whose quotation I showed you in the beginning, who spoke of the tragic epistemology of the Western man. He's primarily a writer. These are just two of his novels, Nagona and Mzingile. He also wrote, this is his doctoral dissertation, which he never published. But I think it's one of the best works on African philosophy. If you're interested in African philosophy, try to look it up. It's really worth it, although not easy to read. He was very, very sort of Heideggerian. I think he took it to extremes. But anyway, I'm putting these there because they, I think, need to be read together. One gives you some insights into the other, and one also relativizes the other. Now, what he says there, at the end of Mzingila, there's the second novel, is this thing up there, and I want to focus on the highlighted elements. Tutahita dilura ambayo haina cha mtu na kitu. We need a language that does not contain the issue of man and thing. I'll come to the Kuwako bit a bit later. So what does he mean by that? You know, the novel actually does not have a plot. It's a meandering plot, basically as a subject or a first-person narrative that deals with the main character wandering about a kind of apocalyptic landscape where the character sees signs of various religions and various people who sort of metamorphose one into another. Anyway, the plot is not very important, but there are also some dialogues with various characters that have deeply philosophical ideas in them. This is one of them. So he says mtu na kitu, that literally means man and thing in Swahili. Man is person, mtu is person, or it's what we talked about, this umuntu in Zulu. And kitu is thing. Why does he capitalize those nouns? What does he mean by that? So this passage really struck me as I was reading it from my philosophical background, and I consulted a Swahili scholar who he's very, sorry, I've told you the secret already. He's very well read. Okay. I was, what do you mean by this, or what does he mean by mtu na kitu? Because I immediately thought of subject and object. It seemed very obvious that Kezelhabi was getting at this epistemology, and that was actually before I read the dissertation. So it was just this capitalization and just the way it made sense. But my colleague said that in fact it's referring to Swahili proverbs. Mtu ni utu. To be human is to have humanity. Mtu si kitu. A man is not a thing. So I was struck by this, by the different interpretation, because after reading the dissertation, I'm convinced that my reading as subject and object is also valid. But then I realized that Kezelhabi, in fact, and this is his concept, horizon of the unsaid, he is projecting Western epistemology into another hermeneutical context. He's really referring to the words that themselves have their own horizon of the unsaid, or hermeneutical horizons. And what does he do by that? What does he actually effectuate? That he wouldn't if he said, subject and object, if he just used the foreign words in Swahili. Well, what he does is that he injects the structure of Bantu languages into his analysis. Now, what is the structure of Bantu languages, and why is it important? Bantu languages are languages south of the equator. Most of the languages in Africa south of the equator are Bantu languages. They are a very large family that have a very similar grammatical structure. There are about 500 of them. Zulu is one of them, Swahili is one of them, Xhosa, Ndebele, Shona, Gikuyu. There are many of them, and they all have what is called noun classes. So we have, for example, gender in German or in French, and they have noun classes, which means they classify beings into up to 23 categories. So there are up to 23 noun classes. Not always does a language have all of them. Swahili, I think, has 15, and they are paired into singular and plural. But basically, these noun classes project a kind of semantic filter upon the world. So people are in one class, prolonged objects are in another, trees, for example, or spires, towers. Water is another, and so on and so forth. So you have this kind of semantic filter that is effectuated by the noun classes, and indeed this filter was used by some African philosophers to suggest there was an ontology based on the structure of languages. A very prominent thinker of that is Alexis Kagame, who did in his two books, these ones. First is his dissertation, and then he published a book, Comparative Bantu Philosophy. He suggested that the structure of, bless you, you will not stop sneezing until I tell you, bless you. So he said the linguistic structure of Bantu languages reveals the manner in which the Bantu conceive the categories of being in their philosophy. And what did he come up with concretely? Sorry, this is just a kind of diagram, because this similar idea goes under the name of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or linguistic relativity hypothesis. He came up with these four categories. So first of all, Umuntu, which is the same as Mtu, Ikintu, which is the same as Kitu in Swahili, and then he had this one of time and space and modality. Now, if you look at it, what immediately strikes you, or should, is that, you know, he has 6 categories. Why not, I don't know, 20? Because Kinyarwanda has many more than these. So obviously, I mean, that's just a way of questioning how he came up with them, but I think this way of thinking, for example, Ubuntu, humanity, would also be there, but he didn't put it, the noun, the abstract noun. But he suggested that this was a kind of specific Bantu Rwandan, as he said, philosophy or ontology. And then Kezelahabi, of course, knew Kagame. So if Kezelahabi is relying on this Mtu Nakitu, is he actually suggesting that the epistemological difference between man and thing, subject and object, not only has ethical implications, these proverbs are referring to ethical principles, but perhaps also ontological repercussions, referring to this division of being into humans, non-humans, and so on. So, a different ontology, we've already seen some, and I just wanted to mention Placide Tempels, who he's seen as the founding father of modern African philosophy, with a book that he published in 1945. He was a Belgian missionary, so there is a certain paradox in him being identified as the key figure. And he suggested that the Bantu, and again he was talking of the Bantu, although he was working with just one people within that group, being is force. So people are not beings, but forces, and the whole world is a kind of force, field of forces. Now, I think I'm getting close to the end of my time. I'll conclude quickly. This is again coming back to Kezelahabi, to this language whose foundation is being. So it also feeds into this ontological reading of it. Of course, being, now this is from his dissertation, you can see that being is really the Heideggerian being. So he capitalizes it in English, and he has some quotations, acknowledged and unacknowledged ones, of Heidegger, as here. So basically he's using the Heideggerian concept of being in Swahili as kuwako. Now what does he do by that? Kuwako is locative. It's existence. It's being somewhere. It's exactly like the German Dasein. So, and he's aware of that, of course. He's aware of the fact that Dasein means something quite different to Heidegger than Sein. And there is also a tradition of using that in Swahili, although I think Kezelahabi was not aware of, well, probably not aware of it when he was writing it. This novel by Mkufia uses kuwa for the being of God, an immaterial entity, so it's this kind of esse, and kuwako for humans. So what is Kezelahabi doing there? He's using Heideggerian being, but using a locative word for it. Being is transformed into being there, or being here. Sein into Dasein, esse into existence. Why would he do that? He makes kuwako a kind of empty concept, a very abstract form of being, or if you like, freedom, radical freedom, no determination. He removes the essentialist connotations of Heideggerian being, like this concept of authenticity. And so I would argue that actually translation to him is destruction. he said that African philosophers must use a destructive rather than a deconstructive stand vis-à-vis the Western philosophy of value and representation. And he does that in his novels both thematically. There is a kind of worldwide chaotic dance, maybe the apocalypse, after which things are not as they were as they were before. But at the same time, and perhaps more radically, he also does that through translating words into Swahili. And Kuwako, I think, is a good example of that. He transposes European philosophical concepts into other hermeneutical horizons, and that changes their meaning in a very radical way. So we saw that, for example, Mtu na Kitu, subject and object, acquire ethical and ontological relevance. So he's in a way merging epistemology with ethics and ontology. Kuwako acquires an existentialist meaning. Now, to conclude, I don't really have a conclusion, but I was just to wrap up, what is Europe from the perspective of African philosophy? Insight, epistemology, a static ontology. So it's seen as a kind of culture of death or deadly static beings, essences that need to be somehow moved. Senghor has a very beautiful quotation about Africa being the leaven that is needed to the white flower. So I think that expresses that kind of dynamic spirit that African philosophers perceive in themselves. Europe is rationality turned into a dehumanizing power, so there is a very ethical and political aspect of criticism of European philosophy. And that's it. Thank you very much.